Hello, everyone. Happy Friday. I'm Katie Nichols. I'm a SANS instructor and director of intelligence at Red Canary. So excited for you to be here to join us for today's SANS Threat Analysis Rundown live stream. Happy Friday, as I said, and I'm so excited to be joined today by Runa Sandvik. She's a security researcher based out of New York, also an East Coaster, I believe. Runa has such a cool career, right? Talking about protecting journalists. She's worked at the New York Times, a Tor Project, lots of other places. So excited to have you here, Runa. How are you?
Thank you. I'm great. Thank you for having me.
So I would love for you to just give the audience a little bit of background on yourself first off, right? You've done so many cool things. What are you up to now? Where have you been? Tell us about yourself.
Um, so for the past 10 plus years, I have focused on security for freelance reporters or for more established newsrooms. And that's still something that I'm doing. It's still something that I'm very passionate about and find really interesting. I've also had more time to just dabble with projects that I've been wanting to tackle and wanting to learn more about, but just I didn't have the time to do before.
I hear that absolutely. And I think what's so interesting is I focus on threats overall, but I think for journalists or others in, high risk categories, it's sort of a different landscape. And I'm curious, why do you think that's so important? Even if we don't protect journalists day to day, I feel like it's sort of important as a global society, like to protect these people. I'm curious your thoughts, like why is that such a passionate area for you?
I think it's a combination of there's the mission, right, of the work that the reporters are doing, of bearing witness, of telling stories, of doing a really solid, really good long-term investigative work. And then at the same time, being able to sort of combine the technical knowledge that I have and the research that I do with the sort of human element of um, ultimately the journalist will have to work the way that they work with the tools they're familiar with the workflow they have, with the apps that their sources are using. And it's then up to me to figure out how can I help them do that in a safe way, which is sort of for me comes back to how do I solve that puzzle. I've always been really really interested in puzzles in general, and so now it's just a puzzle that does have a human social good component to it.
I never thought about it like that as a puzzle, but I love that. And I love what you said, bringing together maybe like journalists who aren't super technical with your knowledge. I think you have a computer science background or like a technical quote background as well, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I do. So I got a bachelor's in computer science, and then I've sort of had a chance to dabble with research and development, project management, more sort of strategic, holistic work, training. I think over the past 10 years, being able to take on all of these different types of roles just means that I also now have a very good idea of what it is that I enjoy, and what is impactful for me, and what I want to do moving forward, which has been really cool.
That's awesome. And I see we have folks tuning in from all around the world. We have someone from Dubai, evening in Italy. Hopefully you're enjoying a little like Chianti. Is that an Italian wine? I don't really know. But folks from around the world, that's awesome.
That's
And then
great.
I wanted to highlight, you recently started a new blog, which is always it's a little scary because then you're like, oh man, I have to like update it and write blog posts. So what are your
Yes.
hopes for your blog? What did you start out writing and what can readers expect to see there?
So I've had a couple of blogs over the years, but I sort of ran into this challenge of well, now I have this thing, but I don't like the design. I don't like the way it looks. I don't like the fact that I haven't written anything in 6 months. And so there were all of these reasons that I just didn't stick with it. And it's something that I've been thinking more about this past year, wanting to share more of the things that I'm learning. And
Mhm.
I recently attended Objective by the Sea in Maui, this Mac OS malware research conference, and just meeting people there who are super excited about what they do, super excited about sharing what they're up to with the community, that do have these blogs and keep that up to date. Just sort of finally drove it home for me that it is about time that I do this for myself. So the solution that I landed on was to set up a site that is separate from my main website, so that if you do visit my main site, you'll just see this like brief notice there. And then if you do want to go check out the research on the blog, then that's there as well.
Nice. And how'd you come up with the name Glitch Cat?
That is a combination of my calico cat and the Corvallium debug ASCII cat that shows up when it throws an error message.
Interesting. And maybe your cat will make an appearance today. We'll see, but
Maybe.
that's
She's
fascinating.
here, but being quiet for now.
For now, we'll see. And I love that. When I started my blog, I had the same fear. I was like, well, maybe I won't write in it for a few months. So what? Right? Like, even if you don't write in it, it's there, and like encouraging people to share their research. And I think it's a great thing to do. Even if you're not going to do it all the time, right? Having that avenue to share your thoughts. So that's awesome. And I will be following that carefully. And this is a great first post kind of with a little bit of your background and kind of what we talked about. I loved reading about, what you said about your fascination with puzzles. So cool background there. And moving into, you mentioned Objective by the Sea. My teammate Tony went there. Really cool Mac conference in Hawaii this year. It's always at like a really neat location by the sea. And you presented there research on the Lamberts, right? Specifically Green Lambert for OS X. So quick note before we dive in here. I know we have lots of different viewers. For this section, we're going to be talking a little bit about some malware that, based on researchers like Runa's work and leaked information, is attributed to the US government. So if US government attribution is not something you want to hang out for, you won't be offended. You can kind of skip forward and come back. So with that kind of notice for anyone watching, tell us a little bit about what's the gist of this research you did that you presented. What's Green Lambert?
So Green Lambert is a piece of malware that, as you mentioned, has been attributed to the CIA specifically. That when the Vault 7, when WikiLeaks published the Vault 7 leaks back in 2017, shortly after Symantec and then Kaspersky came out and said, like, look, we have been tracking this actor under either the name Longhorn or the Lamberts, that we now, based on this leak, have attributed to or believe is related to this leak and the information from the CIA. And so Kaspersky then wrote about a malware called Green Lambert that also has a Windows and Mac OS component. And so I decided to take a look at the Mac OS component specifically.
Mac OS research is something that, maybe people like me, I'm so Windows focused, like we don't hear about every day. And I'm curious kind of what made you interested in this space and why you think OS X research matters as well.
I think the interest was just like, it is this like puzzle. It is something that I've always wanted to learn more about, but never had the time really, or never made the time for. Then now in the past, 2 years spending more time at home, I figured it was a good time for me to dig in. And one of the resources that I found super, super helpful is Patrick Wardle, the organizer of Objective by the Sea, who's also writing a lot of blog posts about Mac malware and just how to like analyze that type of malware. Wrote this open source and free book on Mac malware analysis. And so I've been going through that book and then trying to figure out like, how can I use these different tools and techniques and other things that I know to look into this piece of malware that no one's really talked a whole lot about. Like you would find some mentions of Green Lambert on the Kaspersky site. There's been a research group in China that's written about this, I think in 2019. But aside from that, no one had really dug in and sort of looked into it a bit more, which I thought was a fun challenge. And also, again, it just comes back to that like puzzle of like, can I figure out how this works? Can I figure out something that no one's published before? Can I just figure this out for myself? I find those things to be really interesting and really fun.
That's really cool. So I love how, right, you looked at what others were doing, right? Kaspersky published research on Lambert's toolkit and then kind of built on that, took something that hasn't been talked about a lot. And all of these resources, I should note that we have up, we'll write show notes and a blog later. So watch the SANS blog for that. So don't worry about writing these all down. This is also being recorded, so it'll be on YouTube later. But um, I feel like, I don't know, to me, it's sort of intimidating to like go read Patrick Wardle's book and learn. How did you like make this accessible? Had you done any Mac malware analysis before you started on Green Lambert? Or how would you recommend if someone's a little scared, like, is this accessible? How would you get started?
Had I done a whole lot of malware analysis? No. I had read about it, but I hadn't really dug in. And then Patrick and I spoke about his book a year ago. So I edited his book as he was writing it, and so in that process, having to go through the pages and the examples and all of that, I did learn quite a bit that way. But certainly sitting down and try to figure out, well, okay, I now have this sample and I have these tools. What do I do? What is it that I'm looking for? How do I like figure this out? And I found like a combination of one, just talking to people who have done this work before. Patrick was incredibly helpful and patient in sort of just helping me figure out like just the questions to ask, how to go about finding that type of info. And then also, I think looking at the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which I think we'll chat about later as well, just trying to then look at the different categories in the framework and then see, well, what can we say about the initial access? What can we say about what the malware does on the system? What can we say about how it persists? And that way get an idea of like, what are all the different options? Like, what are all the different questions that we can ask about this sample being on a system? And then try to figure out, well, okay, how do I then answer that question?
That's so helpful to kind of break it down like that because, right, looking at the book outline, it's kind of intimidating, but right, you read malware basics, infection vectors. There are ways that adversaries are going to gain access, right? And thinking about MITRE ATT&CK, initial access, right? Execution, persistence. So that's kind of how I've also tackled learning the Mac OS landscape. Like it was kind of scary and it still is sometimes. And I phone a friend, usually my teammate Tony, on this, but right, kind of understanding, okay, on the Windows side or whatever familiarity you have, I know that, adversaries persist through boot or logon auto start execution. And that's where something like attack can be really helpful because with the transition to kind of parent and sub techniques, right? I go in there and I look at the different types of boot or logon auto start execution. And maybe you're familiar with like registry run keys on the Windows side, but then you see, hey, there are other things on the Mac OS side, right? Like plist modification. So I think that's a really helpful way. Think about like tactics or technique level. If you're already familiar with that, then you can kind of go back and sort of ease into it a little bit. And I really love how in your post on Green Lambert, you kind of explain victimology, right? Part of the diamond model. We have to say diamond model in this. And you talk about, some of the triage you did and the tools, which I think it's really useful. I always find whenever you're reading about malware analysis, like how did you do it, right? If someone wants to replicate it. So
yeah, I really wanted to sort of share the process. And like there was at one point when I was working on this and sort of sharing with Patrick what I had at that point in time, and just then watching him sort of dig into it a bit as well, and hitting this point where I think we were looking at some of the strings early on, and he's sort of like going through and sort of pointing out the strings that are like making sense to him, and that point out the login item and the launch agent, and sort of saying that, well, this suggests that the malware is using these techniques to persist on the system. And then he sort of skipped over the strings below, and I was like, well, actually, that string there points to libevent, which is this library used by Tor and may not have been super well known back in the day. So for me, like this part really stands out. So that was something that, given my previous work and my background, was something that I could add more context to. And so it just sort of goes to show that even if you haven't done a whole lot of malware analysis before, your background and your context and your knowledge will still be unique. There's still something that you can add to it that other people may not have thought of.
I love that so much. And this is such a great example of how like malware analysis seems intimidating, but it's literally a single command strings. And then you look at the strings and you're like, what looks strange? And then I don't know about you, but I just Google the strings or ask someone like, I've never heard of a launch daemon. What's that? Or like, look at MITRE ATT&CK. What's a launch agent? Right. And you learn. No one knows this stuff until they learn it. So it seems scary until you break it down, right?
Yeah, no, I definitely Googled a lot. And it was also, I mean, this project also helped me go from seeing malware analysis of like a macOS sample as this like complete like black box, like sort of intimidating. I didn't really know exactly what kind of questions I could ask or even like how to go about finding the answers, to now having used these different tools and really dug in different areas, having a much better sense of the different areas that I can explore and which questions to ask in the different areas and what I would need to learn more about to figure out. Like, for example, the strings in the sample are encrypted. There is a way that you can decrypt the strings and then learn more about what it is that the piece of malware is doing. But figuring out how to do that and figuring out how to automate it is now like, there is a learning curve there for me and something for me to figure out, which is pretty exciting.
Not an uncommon challenge in malware analysis. Like adversaries don't make it easy. They always encrypt things to make it hard for you. And I'm seeing in the comments, we have a couple recommendations coming in. Dr. Venji, I don't know if I'm saying that right. Floss is a great forensics tool. I haven't used that one. Let me bring that one up because that's a great recommendation. So this is a free tool from FireEye. I think it's FireEye, not Mandiant. Lets you extract strings. That's more on the Windows side, but lots of different tools that can help. And again, you don't know until you learn it. And Bobby is saying, right, and thanks for encouraging others, Runa, who may know not everything, to jump into this. It only seems intimidating until you've done it. So lots
Absolutely.
of findings here. Anything else you want to kind of highlight that you found interesting about the malware analysis you did on Green Lambert?
Let's see. Quick side note, though, I dropped in our chat here a link to a Google Doc that is publicly available, where I went through portions of Patrick's book and just created this like Google Doc that just links to all the different tools that you can use for Mac malware analysis.
Nice.
So it may be helpful.
That's super helpful. Thank you. And we'll make sure that's in our show notes and blog post. Oh my gosh, there's a lot here, huh?
Cool. And I will add to it as well.
Nice.
I think it's been, I mean, for one, I found so many people that were like excited about what I was doing, even though at times I sort of felt like I can't figure this out. This is too hard. My talk's gonna not like, it's not gonna be an interesting talk. Like I'm not gonna have anything new. But I think everyone that I talked to was like super excited, super supportive of it. Incredibly helpful, and there's now like even more stuff there that I can explore and learn and do more about. So it's like I feel like I'm still like riding this wave of excitement from that conference and just like being around people again and learning things and doing things and just sharing that with everyone.
Yeah, and a side note, we'll include this as well, but all the Objective by the Sea talks are on YouTube, including Runa's talk. And that's really awesome to hear that the community is so encouraging. I love those stories about like someone who's not quite sure, and then like you do the research and it's awesome. So congrats on kind of pushing through and having such a successful talk that really adds to the knowledge in the community. It's awesome.
Thank you. It's a lot of fun.
Nice. So lots of decrypting strings. I feel like that's half the
I spent a lot of time there.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Well, we have a couple kind of questions and comments coming in on like the Mac landscape overall. And I don't know this, but someone asked, what's the estimated percentage of malware currently existing on the Mac OS platform? Maybe like looking to compare with Windows. Will never give an actual percentage, but I would say that I think the Mac OS landscape is just so different than Windows or Linux or mobile landscape, right? A lot of like what my team sees day to day is sort of in the adware family, but then you have stuff on the other end of the spectrum that's like really advanced, like Green Lambert. So, I think it's something that we don't hear about every day, but there's still definitely Mac malware. I'm curious if you have thoughts on that, Runa. Like sometimes you hear like, oh, there's no malware on Macs, which, as I think we've talked about, that's not true.
Let's see. I'm gonna just drop another link to a resource that I found the other day. Thomas Reed, if I remember correctly, gave a talk at Objective by the Sea about Mac malware / adware from the Malwarebytes point of view, which I think does a really good job of just like breaking down what they've seen, what that looks like, how it spikes throughout the year. And just like that, plus all the work that Patrick is doing to just research new samples and sharing this with the community, just like goes to show that there is now like Mac malware does exist, and there is. It's hard to say if there's an increase of it. We'd certainly like see more and know of more. I don't know if that's because there is more or because we just haven't found stuff in the past, but either way, it is something that's that more people are looking at now and more people are doing work on and sharing, which is really cool.
That's such a great point. I feel like it's that question for security overall. Like, are things getting worse or are we just getting better at finding things? It's really hard to say for sure. But yeah, Thomas's presentation is also in there. That's one that I think is a great overview of the Mac landscape as well. And here's the link you dropped, which we'll include all of these in a blog. So don't worry about writing them down now. We'll compile all of them for you later on. Another kind of on the Mac OS landscape front, something that Microsoft just put out, which is kind of funny, right? Like, I mean, they're Microsoft, they do security on everything, not just Windows. But this one, I think this was just last night. Yeah, what day is it? They track this new malware as Update Agent, aka Wizard Update. And first off, I really love Microsoft graphics. Their graphics team is so on point. And they kind of track the evolution. And it was funny because as my team was looking at this, we realized this actually overlaps with something that we call Silver Toucan. So a lot of researchers tracking similar things, but what kind of stuck out to me is like this same sort of attack concept that, right, adversaries have to do reconnaissance. Maybe they'd use slightly different commands to do reconnaissance, like looking for system profile, SP hardware type. But that's something that happens on any system, right? Not just Mac OS, or sending command and control heartbeats. So this is kind of an interesting one. Or we talked about, right, Runa's blog post on Green Lambert, plist files, launch agents. These are all kind of common persistence mechanisms on Mac OS. So just another example of Mac OS malware that it exists. It's a thing. And they included another really cool graphic, kind of the chain, right? Similar chain. As I mentioned, not all of the Mac OS landscape involves adware, but really common adware malware family is adload. So often there'll be kind of initial access, drive-by downloads, and then some kind of other payload that's downloaded as well. And there are also hashes. So hashes it didn't happen. There are hashes of this activity. So we talked a little bit about attack. So I wanted to go back to your blog. You actually mapped out attack techniques for Green Lambert. So I'm curious kind of why you decided to go about doing this, what your thoughts on attack are, and I'll chime in because, of course, I was on the attack team previously, so I have opinions. But I'm curious kind of what made you hone in and decide to map to attack?
I think it was two things. One, I had not used the framework before, and so I wanted to try it out. Like, it's something that I'd heard about that I thought sounded potentially really interesting and really neat. I just like didn't really have like a project before. And then the other part, which I think is also always a fun driver, is that no one had done it. So it's something that I got to do and share and contribute with that hopefully is helpful to the community and to the MITRE attack team as well.
Yeah, this is awesome. And I think it highlights what we were talking about, that, right, if you're intimidated by the details of Mac stuff, here, initial access, you talk about how, that is sort of a gap for you, which intelligence gaps are a thing. execution, right? Maybe you're used to cmd.exe on the Windows side, but cool, we have Unix shell on the Mac OS side. It's a different type of shell, right? So just different techniques, identifying those technique IDs. Launch D we talked about, and links to each of those. This one's actually deprecated, so we'll talk about an attack update recently. But yeah, I'm curious how you found this process of mapping to attack, because it's not an easy thing. I'm curious for anyone who's thinking about trying out using attack or mapping to attack, like any kind of advice for them as they get started or things to watch out for?
Yeah, I mean, I had found a lot of resources for getting started, a lot of blog posts around like, here's what it is, here's how you start, here's how you map things. But like sitting down and like actually doing it, I was a bit overwhelmed initially. I was like trying to figure out like, how do I think about this? Ultimately what worked out well for me was just like go through each of those groupings and then look at the MITRE ATT&CK website and look under initial access and just see like what are the options here, and do any of these match what I know about the malware that I looked at, and just then doing that for each one, and then try to figure out, do I have the information? Have I seen the malware do this thing? Do I have enough data to say that it is likely that it is doing this thing, or do I just not have any data at all for this category? And then just sort of mapping it out that way. I did also find two, and I forget which ones, but there were two things that I looked for that like I know what the malware is doing, but I couldn't find anything in the attack framework to represent it. And I believe that's now been included in the latest updates as well.
Nice. I love what you said about taking kind of a structured approach. Like this is something we talk about in intel analysis, structuring your analysis by kind of going through tactic by tactic, which they're listed out on the attack website, right? You can kind of see, and as you highlighted in your post, initial access, that's a gap, but you kind of looked for it. That's one of the ways that I recommend people get started, right? As you said, initial access. Maybe I don't know every single technique and sub-technique, but okay, I think the adversary is trying to gain a foothold with something. Okay, maybe that's a persistence tactic. So starting, and there's a tactic page where you can see all the techniques and then kind of searching through. I also recommend kind of just searching the website or using Google dorking. You know, if you see the term launch agent, like, is that anywhere? Like, let's find out, right? Doing things like that are really helpful as you're getting started mapping to attack. So way to push through. It can't be easy sometimes.
Thank you. I also found that initially I had sort of gone like, well, I have a Mac sample, so I should just look at the Mac framework. But like I mentioned, I had found that there were things that I knew that the malware was doing that I didn't see in the Mac framework. And that was just because it wasn't there, not because that I was wrong or the thing that I had found like doesn't really exist, or like it's not something that is used anymore. So what I did was like go back to there's like a list in there. I think we can click on initial access or persistence, and you can see the full list as it exists for Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. And then just like not assume that one would be just for Windows or just for Linux and never on Mac, but instead just sort of see for myself, does what's written on this page match with what I have?
That's a great point there. And I'm just clicking around different options. There are a lot of ways to navigate the attack website, right? In these initial high-level matrices, you can just click on Mac OS and look at those techniques. And you can kind of show the different sub-techniques under it. But I think that's a great point you made. Like, what if there's something that, was in this malware that wasn't mapped yet that you might have to contribute, right? Looking high level at everything. That's, I think, the benefit of, we talked about techniques and sub-techniques, right? And that's kind of the benefit. If you think about what the overall behavior is, boot or auto start, then you can kind of dive down into the more specific granular sub-techniques. So
exactly.
A lot of good tips. And I wanted to highlight, I think you highlighted this in your blog as well. This is actually a guide that came out from CISA, and MITRE ATT&CK helped out with it as well. best practices for MITRE attack mapping. And this talks about, actually, I think some of the recommendations we talked about here are in this, start at that tactic level, do keyword searches. So if you're getting started mapping to attack, this is a great resource that we'll include in our links as well. And as I was navigating around, we had a, possible oops, whatever, it's a live stream. But I think I'm going to use that oops for good. So I kind of clicked on this launch D technique, and it let us know there's a deprecation warning. And right, this is an example of the fact that MITRE attack is updated regularly. And to highlight, an update actually just came out yesterday. So this is something that I think a lot of people sort of overlook. There's this really useful, basically, change log here. So you can see launch D, right? They let us know, hey, launch D was deprecated, found that that was covered well enough by other techniques. So you can kind of see a full list of what was changed, lots of new groups and new software families that were added. So that's a great resource as well. So yeah, I wanted to call that out. There's update page and then also a blog post talking about version 10 of attack and all the different aspects to it. As I mentioned, right, there are some updates. There's that technique that was deprecated, and then there's also some updates to data sources. One of the things, and I'm sure you found this as you were doing research as well, Runa, that certain data sources will help you identify certain techniques as you go through your analysis. And so they kind of made that a little more granular and changed that up. So a lot of good things. If you haven't checked out MITRE attack update yesterday, definitely worth a look. Anything else we should talk about with attack, Runa? I'm trying to think.
That's a good question.
Nothing else I can think of. Go
Okay.
check it out. So
yes.
Cool. Moving on. Side note, I should mention, people are kind of mesmerized by this. What I'm using is tab groups in Google Chrome. It's really nice. I do this to keep myself organized because I don't know if you're anything like me, I have like a billion tabs open in Chrome or your browser of choice, and you try to stay organized. And so what's kind of nice is you can actually drag and drop things into these tab groups, and it just keeps you organized. And then you can kind of expand and contract them, which is what I'm doing. So I'm just going to go ahead and add this to my Apple tab group. So when I put these links up later, it'll be organized. So just a side note.
I have not tried that. It looks amazing.
It's really helpful. I've shown people that and they're like, oh my gosh, how did I not know about that? So just wanted to kind of mention that as a side note of what I'm focusing on. So if that's the only thing you get out of this live stream, there you go, everyone. Cool. So we've talked about the Apple, the Mac OS landscape. Let's chat about ransomware because it's a continued thing. And I always debate, every month, I'm like, should I talk about ransomware? And it remains one of the greatest threats to everyone. So I think it's probably worth highlighting. One story that we saw this week, REvil went away a few months ago, and then they came back a little bit, and now they went away again. So some of their sites and infrastructure went down again. And this, I think it's an exclusive hat tip to Joseph Menn and Chris Bing from Reuters that came out yesterday about how, according to some sources, the US government might have had involvement in pushing REvil online, or offline rather, like anything, right? We don't really know. They sourced it to 3 private sector experts, 1 former official, but there's nothing on the record from the U.S. government saying that that this was U.S. government. But sometimes that doesn't always happen when government takes action. So this is sort of an interesting one. And Runa, I'm curious if you have thoughts. REvil went away, they came back. What do you think about all this? Are they really gone? Why are they gone? Do we know? How do we know?
I have no idea, to be honest. I am just here for your thoughts on the topic.
Honestly, that's my take as well. No one really knows. I think that we can look at a few, signs of, their website, their happy blog going down. But I don't know. I think optimistically, I think cybersecurity people around the world are kind of fed up with ransomware. So we all kind of hope that some government or someone somewhere is taking action. So we'll keep watching. The thing that I like to remember, though, is that just because one group is gone doesn't mean ransomware is any better, right? There are, 10, 20, there are so many different groups I think counts 60 or 80 maybe active groups. There's always going to be someone to kind of take the place of any of these groups that go down or go away. So we'll watch this and see, but don't get blinded, right? Don't think that just because our evil is gone, everything is better.
The folks at Virus Total had done some cool ransomware research. Just link the post if you haven't seen that
is
yet.
it this one? This was a really interesting one. We have a couple examples of kind of looking at the broader landscape. This report based on ransomware, I think, submitted to Virus Total, breaking that down.
Yes.
A bunch of findings. So yeah, this is a super interesting one. It's important to remember, the visibility, right? It's based on submissions to Virus Total, so not complete. But right, they found 100 not so popular ransomware groups, 130 families being active. Someone mentioned in the chat, Macaw ransomware just popped up this week. So we can find the latest on that.
Interesting.
Yes. So what we're seeing a decent amount of is rebranding, right? So there's suspicion that this new ransomware Macaw locker that's popped up this week is just another ransomware version from the Evil Corp cybercrime gang. And part of the speculation on why they're doing this actually led into some other tabs I had up to avoid sanctions, because the U.S. government is sanctioning a lot of these known cybercrime gangs like Evil Corp. And so if they're like, well, I used to be called Wasted Locker and now I'm having some new ransomware called Macaw Locker, it's a different thing, right? Which might make it easier for victims to pay, trying to circumvent sanctions. So kind of interesting we're seeing what we're seeing.
One thing that I haven't, sorry, can I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead. No, you're good.
That I haven't seen talked about a whole lot in the context of ransomware is the, you have ransomware, then you have the, I guess, appearance or increase or popularity of cyber insurance, and how small organizations like NGOs or even big companies are now required to get insurance for whatever policy compliance related reason. But then if and when they do have any sort of challenges with ransomware, that then impacts insurance. It impacts their renewal of the insurance the year after. Their security budget is now going to cyber insurance rather than anything else that they could actually use that money for, which is sort of an interesting budget financial related impact on especially small orgs that we haven't talked a whole lot about.
It's a really interesting debate. I was seeing if Cobra mentioned insurance. They haven't, but there's a few reports out there right now. And there's a debate over, is cyber insurance making the ransomware ecosystem worse? And my opinion is we can't point to one thing that is causing ransomware to be successful. It's, the opportunity that adversaries have, vulnerabilities that are exploited, right? It's cryptocurrency enabling them. It's, there haven't been enough deterrence actions, right? It's a lot of things. But one of the, points I've heard is, well, cyber insurance, some ransomware actors have said that they're targeting victims they know have cyber insurance because they know they'll get a payment. And so there's this argument, well, is cyber insurance making things worse? I think it's a tough argument to make, right? Insurance can also save companies, but like you said, Runa, it can, those premiums could be spent elsewhere. So I don't think there's an easy answer like anything, right?
Yeah, it sort of brings up this question of is this really how we're going to spend the resources that we have? And are we actually doing better? Are we then making progress? Are we focusing on the things that we need to focus on to better defend the environment? And I don't know that I can say that, yes, spending more money on cyber insurance will help make the org safer.
Yeah, I think it's not an either or, right? But it's always, it's tough to, I would not want to be a CISO trying to make these decisions. Do I get cyber insurance or do I, get an appliance or hire a security person? So no easy answers for any of this. One thing you mentioned is sort of, the question of, is it getting better? And I wanted to highlight a couple other kind of summary reports that have come out. Coveware, they do really great work, and they kind of come out with this quarterly report about shifts they've seen in ransomware over the past few months. One of the challenges, and I've said this so many times of ransomware, is it's really hard to know if it's getting better, which is something we've talked about. But seeing kind of the same data from the same company, or like, quarter by quarter, can help us kind of chip away. So this is one source that I kind of really trust and like to read about. Is ransomware getting better? They found the average payment amount was pretty flat for the last quarter. So this is one, interesting source and something I've talked about a lot as well, right? It's not just encryption anymore. Data exfiltration in 83% of the cases that Coveware saw. So not just encryption anymore, kind of a key finding. One question that Denise asked, how do you keep up with all the threat groups? There are a lot. It's a ton. And I'll kind of give my perspective. One thing that I do is look at summaries like this. So, right, Coveware has highlighted the most common ransomware variants for Q3. I'm like, cool, these are probably ones I need to be looking at. I know my team sees a ton of Conti, a lot of Lockbit 2.0. So I find like other people's summaries of the top things they're seeing helps me track like, okay, what should I be looking at? Runa, do you have any advice? How do you keep up with all of the threat things that are happening?
I follow you on Twitter. That's it.
There you go. Easy. I mean, Twitter, right? No matter who you follow, there are a lot of good people to follow. But yeah, trying to retweet interesting things. I mentioned I like to look at other people's summaries. So my team just started putting out last month sort of our summary for the past month. What kind of trends have we seen? So what are the top 10 threats that we've seen? It's always good to compare these. A lot of companies put out these reports. We've seen a lot of this threat called yellow cockatoo that gives an info stealer based on kind of search engine redirects, right? In talking about ransomware, an interesting thing that we saw over the past month or so was this new ransomware called Blackbite. And what we found, and this gets to sort of the question of how do you track all these different threats? Like we said, there are maybe 80, 100 different ransomware groups. They like to use the same techniques. Talked about MITRE ATT&CK, TTPs. So this new Blackbite group that my team was tracking, they've used similar techniques, resizing shadow copies to try to delete them, right? Print bombing, where like they make their ransom note print out a whole bunch. These are things that you can detect that a lot of different adversaries use, not just one. So that's one kind of way that we have hope, is looking at other people's summaries of threats. It's not perfect at all, but
if I can add one thing to that. So you mentioned tracking the things that that your team is seeing. And for me, I am looking at the things that I am interested in, because really there is so much out there that you can't possibly track everything all the time. So you're going to have to like focus on either what it is that you need or that your team needs, or what you're interested in. There's a bunch of stuff that I don't look at because it's either like not interesting enough, or I get these updates on Twitter or through blogs or through chats like this one.
Absolutely. Focusing on what you see internally, that's a great way to start. A lot of people overlook, like, talk to your own security people, or even if you have a savvy sysadmin, if you're a small team, right, go talk to that person. And what you're seeing internally is a great place to start. I always recommend that as well. Let's see what else we have in ransomware goodies. I wanted to highlight Alan Liska, super smart ransomware sommelier, he calls himself. Works at Recorded Future. He just launched a site, ransomware.org. He also has a book that just came out, or it's coming out soon, that I think he's making most of it available for free. So this is kind of a cool site that I just wanted to highlight, right? Alan is someone that I really trust on ransomware. There are more and more resources about ransomware out there to try to help people, which I think is maybe the positive aspect, if there is one, in this nightmare that we found ourselves with ransomware. Let's see, other things I wanted to highlight. Talked a little bit about Evil Corp, right? Someone mentioned their new Macaw Locker ransomware. One of the kind of many ways that we can try to deter adversaries, the global we, right, is through financial actions, sanctions, that kind of thing. So some interesting documents out from the US Treasury last week that are sort of worth looking at. They have data from the Bank Secrecy Act, and they kind of looked at that for first part of 2021. which, I mentioned it's so hard to get data about ransomware trends, what's getting better, what's getting worse. So this is another interesting note to compare. They talk about, what they used to create these metrics, but a lot of interesting takeaways here. One that hit me was they have this table towards the end of, different trends, and then they have how they kind of tracked different wallet addresses for ransomware families. And in this table, which we'll eventually get to, scrolling, they didn't identify the variant names. A couple of people have commented that if you do a little legwork, you might be able to figure out kind of which variant it is. But I think this is sort of interesting because we start to see, all right, which ransomware variants will take what type of cryptocurrency. And this sort of sends a message, I think, that the US government is tracking wallets used by ransomware actors. So kind of an interesting one. All right, let's see, what else do we have in ransomware? There's another document out of Treasury last week just talking about complying with sanctions. So if your org is ever thinking about paying ransom, this is probably a good one if you are US based. Take a look at how you can comply with sanctions from the US government. So for any Treasury nerds, a lot of good stuff out there. All right, I think we should move on from ransomware. It's a thing, but there's other stuff going on. Another topic that I wanted to bring up, and actually someone mentioned it in comments, TA551 and Sliver. So TA551, I actually showed this in the blog that my team put out. TA551 is a really prolific kind of initial affiliate who delivers malicious emails. You see it all the time. They use a fairly the same kind of file names over and over. It's usually request.zip or info.zip. And they, what's so worrisome about them is not that initial maldoc, right? The zip file, usually it's a Microsoft Word document, but it's that they deliver other malware, like iced ID or things that can lead to ransomware. So some interesting research came out from the folks over at Proofpoint this week about how TA551, this adversary, is using a red team tool called Sliver. So I don't want to get into open source tool debates, offensive security tool debates, but I wanted to highlight this one because, right, a lot of people focus on red team tools like Cobalt Strike, but there are a lot of these out there. For example, this new one, Sliver, which is open source, so probably worth looking. And what we found this week as various people put out reports is it's not just TA551 who uses Sliver. There's this other affiliate tracked under the name Stolen Images Evidence. That's the subject they use. That this other cluster is also using Sliver in their infection chain. So kind of an interesting trend here, and a new open source framework that security teams should probably take a look at. So the nice thing about open source is, right, you can download it, you can test it in your own environment. So I just wanted to highlight Sliver as something that, right, red team's adversary emulators might use, but some different adversaries have used it as well. And on this topic of kind of red team tools, I also wanted to highlight, right, people are very familiar with Cobalt Strike. We know that Cobalt Strike is used in many, many ransomware operations. But I found Cobalt Strike, and kind of coming back to where we started with malware analysis, like the inner workings of Cobalt Strike are often really inaccessible. And as a CTI analyst, I'm like, I don't really understand what all these red teamers are talking about. So Alyssa from Mandiant put out this really great piece last week, I believe it was, on Cobalt Strike, which, if you have ever been like, I don't really understand what Cobalt Strike is, or when someone says beacon or team server, what does that actually mean? This is a great breakdown. So props to Alyssa and the team for putting this out. Highly recommended reading, so you can kind of get on the same page with red teamers or anyone who's talking about Cobalt Strike. Have you done much research into Cobalt Strike or any offensive security tools, Runa? Is that in your area? I'm sure they target journalists as well.
Probably, but no, it's not something that I've looked at yet. What about you?
A little bit, yeah. We see Cobalt Strike quite a bit in ransomware operations. So It's kind of a predictable chain, right? We see the initial access, we see something like Cobalt lately, then we see reconnaissance, we see Cobalt strike, and we know that ransomware is likely to come. So worth looking at kind of along that entire ransomware chain. Let's see what kind of comments we got. People who like to open zips. Okay, so don't open, if you get a request.zip or info.zip, that's might be TA551. Don't open it, report it. And just a reminder, I'll be sharing all the links afterwards. So keep an eye out on Twitter and the SANS blog. So going back to ransomware, actually, sort of a little bit, I wanted to highlight a new group out of Mandiant called Fin12. This one is kind of cool because actually probably a year ago, it was almost exactly a year ago, two awesome analysts from Mandiant came on this webcast and talked about this unknown, uncategorized cluster called UNC1878. I love talking about group names. We won't get into that here, but this is a blog post I'll share about how Mandiant FireEye tracks their groups. So a year ago, they were tracking this cluster as UNC1878. They gave a really cool presentation on this live stream about spooky Ryuki, talked about how these adversaries, this cluster led to Ryuk ransomware. And now that UNC has graduated. Started out as an uncategorized cluster. Now, Mandiant recently announced that this is an adversary named Fin12. They kind of elevated it to a financially motivated group, Fin12. So worth reading about that. And I think it's just kind of interesting to see how over time analysts are able to track this activity, kind of add more confidence, get more information, link things together, and then elevate it to, right, hey, we think this is a financially motivated actor. I also think this is significant. This is something I've chatted with friends about because it's a challenge to track the actors behind ransomware. So if you think about what we've talked about today, we talked about Ryuk and we talked about Macaw ransomware, and there are different affiliates, right, who often will pass off access to those who actually operate the ransomware, do the encryption. It's a really complicated ecosystem. And so what I think is cool about Fin12 is it kind of helps us as a community say, hey, these are these actors. They are people, financially motivated actors who then are behind ransomware. So kind of an interesting one that is worth looking into. And there's also a presentation on Spooky Ryuki, the final chapter. So worth a look. And shout out to Van and Aaron who've done awesome research since they joined us last year on this live stream. Well, I think we're getting close to the top of the hour, so let's start to go ahead and wrap things up. A couple things I wanted to mention. First off, share the mic in cyber. If you have not heard of this, this is a really awesome initiative that's going on today to try to elevate the voices of Black and Brown practitioners in cybersecurity. So on Twitter, go check out the hashtag share the mic in cyber. It's also on LinkedIn, I believe. And check out some new people, some new voices of people who are underrepresented in this community, right? Check out their stories. So shout out to Camille and Lauren who kind of created this effort that's grown into a huge thing. So check out a lot of these professionals, people that you might not know, new voices in this community. That's happening on social media today. Retweet, like, subscribe, all of those things. So the other thing I wanted to mention, Runa, you wanna share this upcoming conference that you're excited about?
Yes, CyberWorkCon in DC in November. It is also virtual, so if you're not able to make it in person, then you can just watch all the talks online. I am just very excited to see people again and to see friends and sort of usual suspects. And they recently announced the agenda, which looks pretty amazing as well. So I think it's going to be a really good event.
Yeah, this is such a cool conference. And yeah, it's $50 for virtual. I think John Holtzquist, who runs it, has said he might be sending kind of swag. Don't quote me on that if I'm wrong, John. But yeah, the agenda is so cool. We've talked about, like your work, Runa, protecting journalists, like Chris Bing and Raphael Satter are speaking, who are two Reuters journalists, I believe, who I really respect. They're folks from Microsoft. Juan is kind of a awesome, respected threat researcher in this. And we got Shane Huntley from Google. We got Alan Liska. We got all kinds of folks. I think we have Dimitri, we have Alex and Katie from CrowdStrike. So a lot of different voices and people who are really smart in this community. So definitely check this out. And yeah, in person sold out, but you can watch virtually. So John, you owe me another pair of socks because we plugged your event.
I would like a pair of socks too.
All right. We'll tweet John Holtquist later on, and they're Cyber WarCon socks. So we'll see if maybe we can get ourselves hooked up with some more of those.
I like the sound of that.
I like it. Awesome. Well, we're getting towards the top of the hour. Runa, thank you so much for joining. It was really fun chatting today. People want to reach out, runasandvik.com. You can also find us both. We are incessantly on Twitter, so that's a great way to reach us. And as a reminder, this recording will be on YouTube, and we'll post a blog with all of the links to all of the amazing resources. So with that, Runa, thank you so much for your time. Awesome catching up, and hopefully I'll see you in a few weeks at Cyber WarCon.
Likewise. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Happy Friday, everyone. Stay well, and we hope to see you next time. Take care.